Hey everyone, Andy here. Welcome back. Today I'm asking the question, when were comics ever made just for kids? Or to phrase it better, what were comics ever made just for kids? In fact, were comics made for kids, full stop? Now, the reason I'm asking this question is because as I've gotten older and I've been rereading a lot of the classics and I've been thinking about the origin stories of some of my favorite superheroes, I realized that these these stories taken in isolation, I mean, if you take away the superhero element, just these stories alone would be pretty horrendous to adults, but let alone children. These are the kind of stories that you would want to shield your children from. So, to give an example, if there was a story on the news which basically went along as follows: a young boy, sole survivor of a fatal robbery. His parents were gunned down in front of him, and now, of course, he's traumatized for life. Is that the kind of story that you would share with your children? Because that would unpack a whole bunch of questions from your kids, right? Oh, you're not going to be around forever. Do parents die? If we go outside, will we get shot? I mean, these can be traumatic things for a child to process. And yet, this is the origin story of one of the greatest superheroes of all time, Batman. Batman, who is loved by children all around the world, as well as adults, of course. But most people become introduced or acquainted with Batman at a very early age. Most people who collect comics throughout their lives begin their journey when they're kids, and it just sort of progresses into adulthood. So that's Batman for you. Give you another example. Let's take Peter Parker, aka the very friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Yes, his origin stories are linked to being bitten by a radioactive spider. That's how he got his powers. But what made him into Spider-Man? What made him want to go out and fight evil? It was the very tragic death of his uncle Ben, who got gunned down again in the street by a mugger, leaving behind, of course, his widow and Peter's aunt May. And Peter's had a very tough time throughout the comic book history timeline. I mean, he lost his uncle Ben, but he also lost the first love of his life, Gwen Stacy, who was murdered by the Green Goblin. Um, it's been pretty horrendous for Peter. I mean, I think young children thinking how cool it is to be Spider-Man, spider powers crawling up the wall, shooting web out of your wrists. I mean, it sounds great, but if you really think about the kind of life that Peter's led and the loss he's had to suffer, it's not something that most kids would want to take, as part of the package deal. Which is why I think most kids, when they think about Spider-Man or Batman or any hero, they I think they don't really process the tragic element. They just look at the colorful costumes and the cool superpowers they have, right? That's what it seems to me, at least, anyway. Because if someone said to you, "Hey," if you were a child and someone came up to you and they said, "I'm going to give you superpowers, but in order for you to get those superpowers, your aunt, uncle, mum, dad, brother, sister has to die a horrible death," I think most kids will probably say no. Some might be tempted. I don't know, but I would definitely say no, and I'm hoping that anyone who's listening in would probably say no. And whilst we're on the topic of tragedy, what about the origin stories of Superman? I mean, again, Superman is probably the most recognized superhero of all time, with arguably the most amazing superpowers of all time. He is the original superpowered super being, right? In terms of what superpowers would mean to the average person or to a child. It's Superman. He can fly. He can bend steel in his hands. He can move planets, man. I mean, what Superman can pretty much, depending on what decade you sort of like read him in, he can do pretty much anything. And yet, and of course, that means that kids would love the idea of being Superman just for the ability to fly through the air with a cape on. Who wouldn't want that? But the origins of Superman are probably the most horrific of all. I mean, his entire planet blew up. Um, Billions of people died in order for Kal-El to be transported via rocket ship to Earth, where he became Clark, and then he became Superman. If Krypton hadn't exploded, maybe his parents, I mean, obviously his parents wouldn't have sent him then, and he would have lived a normal life as a Kryptonian with no superpowers. But no, the planet exploded. Everyone died. And would anyone argue that that was a small price to pay for the Earth to have Superman? I mean, I don't know. That's a lot of death, you know. But again, I mean, this is horrendous, horrific stuff. And can a child really process the death of billions? Can a child process the death of an entire planet? I don't think they can. When I was reading Superman, yes, I knew the origin story of, Krypton blowing up and this alien comes to Earth and the alien is Superman and the alien looks just like us, which is amazing. What are the chances? But anyway, I never really thought too much about Krypton blowing up. I thought about the cool superpowers that Superman had and the costume and how cool he looked. That's what I thought about. And those amazing battles he had. But did I ever process? Did I ever really sit down and think about all the life that had been lost in that cataclysmic event on Krypton? No, I didn't. I'll be honest with you. I didn't. I think about it now because I'm older, more reflective, and it's like, wow, man, that's deep, very deep. Now, all these things are pretty tragic and pretty horrible. I would argue that Batman and Spider-Man are more relatable just because of the slightly more human scope or human element involved. With something like Krypton, an alien planet billions of miles away blowing up, or say, for example, Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet, clicking his fingers and half the universe disappears. These things, of course, would just be just fancy sort of storytelling for most children. There's no way that they could really understand the concept of an entire planet blowing up or this this Titan clicking away half the universe. But if you carry on the theme of relatable incidents, then one of the most horrible ones has to be A Death in the Family, where Jason Todd gets killed in the most horrible way possible by the Joker, who basically batters him to death with a iron crowbar. And as an adult, from an adult's perspective, let's unpackage that, shall we? So you've got the death of this teenager, who's basically the ward of Batman, Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne's taken him on. He's put on this costume. He's taken this kid along. He was responsible for Jason Todd. He knows this. He lives with this guilt. He was responsible for Jason Todd, and he was responsible in a way for the death because if he hadn't brought him along, this teenager, that kid would still be alive. And to make it worse, he gets killed. Jason gets killed by Batman's arch nemesis, the Joker. Batman's had plenty of chances to put the Joker down, but of course he has his no-kill policy, right? Which means that a lot of other innocent people end up getting killed. And of course, that's a whole different topic to consider, right? Should Batman have killed the Joker a long time ago? Something we can look at later on. But in this case, as far as comics being for kids, I would argue that this is not a comic for children. It's a comic perhaps for teens who are getting mature enough to understand what it means to be in that situation. Being able to sort of like imagine being in that situation, which I think most kids can't. And as an adult, I think as an adult, because you go through life, and as you go through life, you lose loved ones, you lose friends, horrible things happen to you. This is just I guess if you want to experience life, if you live to experience life, then these things, you will experience these things. Perhaps not in the comic book setting of something like Death in the Family, but horrible things will happen. And when those things happen, I think only then can you truly empathize or understand, have a glimmer of understanding what the writers are telling you with this story. And that being said, A Death in the Family is, in my opinion, definitely not something that I would share with a child. I think I would wait until they were a little bit older. But of course, comic books being what they are accessible to children and adults alike. And I think a lot of kids, when they would have read, if they read this comic pre-teens, I think they would have been impressed with the artwork. and with the shock value of, oh my God, Robin's dead, this is terrible. But they wouldn't necessarily feel it in the same way that, a comic book reader who happens to be a dad with 2.5 kids and a wife who's perhaps, lost a loved one recently to a horrible, violent event. I mean, you take someone like that and you take a child, and I think the adult is going to be way more perceptive and affected by a story such as this. I mean, whilst we're on the theme of Batman-related tragic events, we cannot, or I certainly cannot, overlook the Killing Joke, where in one particular scene we have the Joker basically shooting Barbara Gordon in her stomach and paralyzing her because it hit her spine, and what the Joker does after, when it's revealed what the Joker does to Barbara after she's been shot, um, uh, this is the stuff of nightmares. It really is. Again, if you try and if you isolate this and you try and describe to a kid what's happened to this poor lady, or what happens to her father subsequently, it's frightening. It's frightening stuff. And again, it's passed is passed around as this to those people who don't understand the comic book medium. I think this would be nothing more than popcorn storytelling. It's fancy drawings, and who cares? But if you're a comic book fan, and those of you listening in obviously are comic book fans, you and I can definitely understand the depth of this story, the horror of this story. Um, and again, would I expose a child, a preteen, to this type of story with this type of graphic content? I would say no. I would say no. That question that I had, were comic books ever made for children, started off with the historical sort of backdrop to Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, because these are the old sort of golden age of superheroes, the birth of superheroes, right? And and so you think to yourself, well, if you look at the origins of comics, that should give you a good idea as to whether they were actually intended for kids. And of course, we've already seen that Batman has a tragic origin with death involved. Superman has a lot of death involved in his tragic origins. Peter Parker's like one of the unluckiest guys on the planet with the amount of death he's had to sort of, process in his time as a superhero. These are all very, very sad, depressing tales of loss. Um, Something which I think you would not want to burden a child with, even if it comes to storytelling. But this stuff here, I mean, this is just a whole different level. This is like evil, evil to the nth degree. And for those of us who've had the pleasure of reading The Killing Joke, which was beautifully drawn by Brian Boland, by the way, a fantastic artist. But anyone who's read this knows what happens next with James Gordon, stripped, naked, chained, and flooded with this collage of images of his daughter Barbara having been shot, paralyzed, and now stripped naked, and laid out in these very explicit poses. This is the kind of stuff that if this was a movie, I'm very confident that if this was adapted into a movie, then it would definitely be, or it would have to be, at minimum a 15 rating. At minimum, I mean, I would say 18. I would say this should be an 18 rating, but it would definitely be a 15 rating at minimum, because it's really horrendous stuff. Now, if you're a grandfather who happens to be a Batman fan, or a father who happens to be a Batman fan, you've got kids, you've got daughters, and you go and watch this movie, or you read this comic book, it's going to hit you pretty hard, because the angst, the horror, the sort of pain that James Gordon is feeling in this caption over here. I think any father, if number one, you don't want to imagine this thing happening when you're a father. You don't want to imagine this thing happening to your kids, so you won't. You'll try not to. But you can empathize with this. If you're a dad, you can empathize with this. And I think if you're an adult, you can just empathize with the plight that this character finds himself in. And I think this is the Joker at one of his most sort of evil, cruel, depictions. It's bad. It's bad. And so, going back to the idea of, were comics ever intended for kids, considering the tragic origins of so many of its heroes, death, destruction, loss, are these themes that children would necessarily a want to explore or even understand what they're looking at if they do read it. And something like The Killing Joke, which clearly shouldn't be read by kids, but probably has been read by a number of kids, because let's face facts, comic books are accessible to everyone, right? You go into a comic book store and you pick up this book and you take it to the counter. No one's going to check your age and say, hey, listen, are you over 18 before you buy this book? Unless there is something on the cover which says this is only intended for mature audiences over 18, not to be sold to anyone under the age of 18. But how many comic books have that moniker? None that I've seen. I mean, something like Vertigo titles from DC, right? They have a caption at the front of the cover saying this is for adults, or it's like a mature content, mature readers only. But that wouldn't stop a preteen or a young teenager from buying the book. It wouldn't. I've bought these books when I was a kid, and no one stopped me. So yeah, that's a question to chew over, right? Were any comic books really intended for kids? Because if they weren't, then I have to say that the writers and then the artists who have created such works of epic proportions, you have to say hats off, because they've been able to really get away with stuff that movie makers or record producers just wouldn't be able to. I mean, comic book, it seems to me now, has to be the most progressive art form there is on the planet, because they they permeate every aspect of society, even when they shouldn't. They have access to everyone. But yeah, the more I read into this, the more I realize that perhaps some comic books are intended solely for children, but I think a lot of them are not. And yeah, that's my take on this. Thank you very much for listening to my rambling, as ever. I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and like and subscribe if you will. Any comments, please let me know. If you think I'm completely off the rocker, let me know. I like to hear differing views. And yeah, guys, thank you. I'll catch you in the next one.